There might be a little background noise, but that's understandable because we're getting ready to put together a little museum for the Mr. International Joe Beasley. Mr. Beasley, what I would like for you to put in a perspective for me, because of your experience, your service experience, your experience with all these organizations and the Beasley Foundation. The death of George Floyd, put it in a perspective so young folks don't characterize him as a martyr or a hero. How do we do that?
Well,
And take it from a historical perspective of what happened in the build-up of the protests.
we're all wretches that's undone. And so, as your name is Clyde Bradley, mine is Joe Beasley, we talk about Mr. Aubrey, and we talk about the gentleman killed in Minneapolis. It has caused such an uproar across the world. These are just names, but we know we have all our feet of clay. But there are straws that eventually breaks the camel's back, that we're simmering like a pressure cooker, that so many things are upon us. And then there are some triggers. And I think the killing there with the police officer putting his knee on the neck of this young black man, and he for almost 9 minutes, and then on camera we see he dies. Big man, 6'6", full of life. Like all of us, make mistakes, make errors. There was some report that he perhaps had passed a counterfeit $20 bill at a convenience store. And these convenience store owners that are located in the African American community across the country, this is a matter that I'm working on now because it's something that has to stop. We have to take charge and control of the commerce that goes on in our community. And I don't know exactly what's going on, but all the service stations throughout the nation, and with the service station come these little convenience stores, and they're owned by people from the Middle East, and somehow African Americans can't get these deals. But this is the genesis, I understand it. This money was passed, and then the police was called, and then there was a police stop, and then the insensitivity of so many of our police. And understand now there's a move by the city council in Minneapolis to really defund the whole police department, and really start from scratch, which I think is a good idea. And I think other departments are being introspective now, because there's this blue code of silence that somehow, and I remember, as you probably know, I know you remember, Clyde, just 6 months ago, I was on my way to my office, and I'm a half a block from my office, and I got caught up in what was really a police that was serving a warrant on a house. And it's a one-way little street just before I get to my office, and eventually someone was pointing back up, and but these officers was attired in military garb, had face masks on, and you know, I think it's just an overstretch. But then as I stopped my vehicle and tried to engage it into reverse, there were Hispanic officers there, and there was a number of African American officers there, and of course the white officer white Atlanta police officer opened his car door and stuck his pistol right in my face. And of course, me being a retired police officer myself, understand the use of force. And one of the things, whatever police department you're associated with, this is universal. That if you draw your revolver and point it at someone, then you have to shoot it. Now this guy didn't. Obviously, I'm here, so he didn't shoot his gun. So I'm still here. So I guess he really was trying to say, "Old nigger, I'm gonna scare you to death." But of course, that didn't happen. But back to the immediate question, the background or the profile of this gentleman from Minnesota, I think that's not important. He simply there's a culture in the police department, and there's tolerance on the part of the citizenry. But it's just been too much. And now what we see, which I think could wind up being a good thing, because all over the world, the media is not reporting. They report, as always, about what happened in Europe and what's happening in the white world, in Australia, whatever. But there's a great deal of outrage throughout the world, including throughout Africa. And so this notion that somehow we would live under tyranny and threats and insults, from the police is something that we have to re-examine. So I'm happy that you're here for us to talk about these matters.
Well, looking at you being a former police officer, military, at one point in time I remember them saying police were to protect and serve. What happened to that?
Well, quite frankly, it's always been a lie. The whole idea of policing grew out of chasing down so-called runaway slaves. And so, we were somebody else's property, and they had bought us, and we got tired of being treated like we was nobody, and we tried to run, and we ran. And so the police kind of grows out of that tradition. Well, this notion that the police was to protect and serve has been a misnomer, quite frankly. But I think it gives us an opportunity now for us to kind of reassess that, and then really for us to say that if you're going to be a police officer going forward, your job is to protect and serve. And rather than to militarize the police, I think we need to disarm the police. And there are places in the world, and I lived in England for 4 years during my time in the military. And of course, even up until today, the police in England, they don't carry, the beat cop don't carry a weapon. So this notion that we live in a time where the civilians have outgunned the police, which is probably the case. But if you, as the Bible suggests, that we need to beat our swords into pruning hooks, and I applaud that. So I just think we need to study war no more. And if we would disarm, my message to Mayor Bottoms, let's disarm the police here in Atlanta. Take the guns away from them. Now we probably need some special units when some situation arises, but this is an opportunity for us to do it a different way. And I think there's a more excellent way. And I think force begets force. And so I think it's time for us to try something different.
What is the psychology behind the protester, raised hands, no weapon, you have the police officer with the mask, the shield, the gun? What is that doing to our psyche?
Well, I think it really, people's adrenaline are flowing now, and so we behave a little bit in an aggressive manner. It's either fight or flight. And when we see the police officers push a 75-year-old man down and just say to hell with him and just keep walking. I'm 83. So I just think that we need to have an attitude check. And this is a good time for us to check our attitudes, and if in fact we're going in the wrong direction, and I surmise that we are, then we need to make a mid-course adjustment.
Now, because of your international travel and your participation in terms of protests in the past, what are the demands we need to make? And do you think a boycott on an individual store would be relevant in order to get those demands?
Well, let me suggest, and because I'm working a couple of cases now, and I think we've discussed this, Clyde, in the past, that something is going on that's, I believe, very sinister, that we have to get to the bottom of, because I think it's one of the most provoking things throughout the nation. There seems to be some kind of hookup, if you will, between these service stations owners, whether it's Chevron, Texaco, whatever. They have seemed to have worked out some kind of deal with people from India, Pakistan, or somewhere to put these stations in our community. It's almost impossible for an African American to own a service station and then a convenience store in our community. I think this is an opportune time for us now to address it, and we need to address it from the standpoint of the franchise, not the franchise, but we need to go to the source and say to them, we want all the service stations that's in the African American community throughout the United States in the hands of African Americans, because as it stands now, it's in the hands of people that don't respect us, don't hire us. And I think it's a powder keg. We're talking about a real powder keg. This is a powder keg. I'm investigating an incident that happened in Lithia Springs, which is a suburb of Atlanta. Right now, as we speak, this young man that went into the service station to get gas. Now he had bought a cigar, which he had the receipt for, that was in his pocket. But when he went into the service station to pay for his gas, and this station was owned by someone from India, the owner had accused him of stealing the cigar. And he'd paid for the gas and had gotten the gas. And then the owner would say, because he had stole the cigar, was on the phone with the police, and this young man, and I have his statement that's available, saying that because of his fear, because of police confrontation, that he left. And so I would suggest that this is a place we need to start right now, to say to these owners like Texaco, and again, a litany of them, that we're not going to tolerate it anymore. That's a trigger that's in our community right now that we need to draw back from. And so when we look at, we hadn't talked about the young man, Aubrey, and Brunswick, Georgia. And when we see that tape, and then when we hear the story now as it unravels, I watched the grand jury proceedings. This young man was pursued like a wild animal.
A dog, a deer.
Oh, absolutely.
Going hunting.
And these vicious people that hearts filled with hate for whatever reason, grab a firearm, a big Magnum pistol, and then the son grab a shotgun, and then they pursue this young man that is having a jog, and had stopped in a building that was being under construction, which is normal. And of course, there are videos where that many people was going in just looking at how what the construction was. And I understand in the case of this young jogger that there was a water source in the place, and so it is my opinion, an opinion of others, that he stopped to maybe get some water, and then they get some water, and they jog on, and he's jogging through this white community. Of course, his own home was less than a mile, as I understand it, from where this incident occurred. So, and then I think the thing that really bothers me terribly is that this incident happened, and the police in Brunswick, Georgia, had viewed the tape and that a murder had occurred. And the police, as I understand it, Brunswick police wanted to execute and do their job, but the district attorney, who was a young female, had prevented them from making arrests. And of course then another district attorney from the adjoining jurisdiction was given the case, and of course somehow he recused himself. But before he recused himself, he had put in writing the fact that he thought that the father and son should have been exonerated. And so therefore, we're in the process now of gaining signatures from the 6 counties that Mr. Barnhill represent in southern Georgia. We want to recall them. And then on the 19th of this month, there will be a caravan coming out of Waycross, Georgia, coming to the State Bar of Georgia, asking that this district attorney, Mr. Barnhill, would be disbarred. He needs to be disbarred. And then, of course, they assigned then a third district attorney to the case.
Cobb County.
No, that's the fourth.
What?
Yeah, that's the fourth. The third district attorney, I don't recall his name right offhand, but you can Google and pull it up. But he had to recuse himself because he had just been picked up for a DUI a few weeks earlier, and he had to check himself into a rehabilitation program. So that's the state of policing that we have going on in the United States. And of course, as you probably know, in Brunswick, due to misconduct on the part of the chief of police, I don't know if he's in jail now or not, but he needs to be in jail because he's covered up misconduct on the part of many of his officers there that was involved in sexual assaults and so forth. So I just think that the whole notion that we would kind of disband some of these agents, just defund some of these agencies is quite in order. And I must add, however, rather hurriedly, that I think here in Atlanta and Fulton County, Mayor Keisha Bottoms, who's being considered as a possible running mate for vice president, I think he's doing an incredible job. And we've never had a white police chief, female police chief, Chief Shields. I think he's doing an incredible job as well. But and with a police force the size of the one that's here in Atlanta, we have a lot of rogues on the police force, and which has been displayed in these recent protests. There's a lot of aggression on the part of police officers, and while we don't condone, tolerate the violence, the disfiguring of building the graffiti and knocking out windows and stealing property. We don't condone that. But peaceful protests and redress for grievances is the so-called American way.
If you look at the history of the police, the culture of the police, the association of the police, it's a fraternity, it's a club. How do you change the nature of that?
Well, I think that it has to be a radical approach. That's why I was suggesting earlier, Clyde, is that I think we need to do something radical. Now, there's I've been sitting here in my window, and I haven't seen so many tanks driving by than when I was in Vietnam. And of course, I think we need to get rid of all of these tanks and all of these implements of destruction and violence, which sends a signal to the citizens. So I think that we need to take this radical approach now. And since Atlanta is considered the Black Mecca, the home of the civil rights movement, even though, as you well know, that we're fast moving because of gentrification. Atlanta will no longer be so-called the Black Mecca because we'll no longer be a majority black city. And I would suggest that perhaps Keisha Lance Bottoms perhaps will get a second term because Atlanta's still rather liberal to some extent. But I believe that Ms. Bottoms is going to be the last African-American mayor ever in the city of Atlanta because of our polarization. And so these moments come, and I think it's in the midst of this coronavirus that somehow, God has in His own wisdom have shut the world down, and so the coronavirus. We say it's not a respect of people, but then when we look at the fact that people whose health are fragile, like African Americans, because we're poor, we live in small, cramped spaces, and so when they say that we need to shelter at home, and but if you are living in a very small unit and you have a large family, it's impossible to really, shelter in. And so this coronavirus has shown us in places like Chicago, Illinois, which is a majority white, of course. 73% of the deaths in Chicago, I believe, was in the African American community. And, even here in Georgia, we know it's been very disproportionate. But because of our lack of good record keeping, we don't have an accurate record, but we know that it has hit us harder. And so therefore, this call that's been out there for some time for reparations to repair us for the damages that we have suffered since we've been in this country, serving 246 years as chattel slaves. And then another 100 years of terrorism under the reign of the Ku Klux Klan, and then a period of the civil rights struggle. We're very fragile, and this racism is not good for one's health. And so we're suffering on the dual maladies of induced coronavirus that we don't know the source of it. We know that it's all over the world and all over the globe, and we've had to close down governments and operations, and even our solar system and our environment has taken some relaxation, and so that we can't drive our cars, and so all the pollution now has abated somewhat. It's been good for the environment. So we're in a quite a quandary right now.
Now, Mr. Beasley, I know that you have worked with the task force for the homeless for quite some time. Now, I have ridden around this city and I have seen all this new construction. All right, I've seen all these white folks out here jogging, but I've never seen so many people out here in the street living in the streets, next door or inside of a storefront.
Well, you know, Clyde, my heart bleeds when I look out my window sometimes and I see people that's sleeping in the doorways of like the bank and there's like a barber shop across the street. The people are sleeping in those spaces, and you know, sometimes I feel so bad that since I have an extra bedroom, I want to go out there and say, you know, come on over here to my house, and you know, but because of we live in such a disruptive society and there's so much mental illness, sometimes you can't even take a chance on trying to do good if you want to do good. So there's no reason why we should have homeless and hungry people in the United States. And it's because of our callousness. And then we look at leaders like Donald Trump, who is really, I think it's an abbreviation, is a serial liar that has no humanity anywhere in his body. And I've been looking over the last few days at military leaders like the four-star general that was on his staff that had not suggested, but said flat out that Mr. Trump is a divider, that he's intentionally have sought out to divide America. And then another place, of course, where I spend a lot of time, as you know, in Brazil, which is majority African as a nation. And I don't know how, you know, these anomalies come about, but the president of Brazil is even more deranged than Donald Trump. And he even is going against the notion of social distancing. And so I believe, and they stopped counting now. You know, they're in denial, the government, and so they're not counting anymore how many people are dying in Brazil. But it's my belief, because of the fragile condition of the majority population there, African Americans, that their death toll eventually surpassed that of the United States, which now stands at around 110,000 people that have died of this coronavirus.
Now, if you look at, I want to go back to Mandela. Where we are right now, at one point in time, this is where South Africa was with the Africans in terms of government, in terms of releasing Mandela. There was a piece put together in terms of truth and reconciliation. How does that work?
Well, you know, I think Mandela, I love him to death. He was a wonderful man, and the notion is that we serve the present age. And when Mandela came to power, the country of South Africa had been under apartheid for many years, which means the Africans in South Africa had no rights. So for Mandela then to move from a minority white government that was extremely oppressive to a black majority government that was serving the present age. And of course, he put together that Truth and Reconciliation panel, which I think was a wonderful idea at the time. But then 25 years later, as you know, I'm in South Africa at least once a year, sometimes more than that. But I go to South Africa at least once a year to, in my position, serving as the advisory chair for the African Leadership magazine. And we award in Johannesburg, South Africa, the award for the outstanding African man, outstanding African woman, and outstanding African business person of the year. So 25 years after black rule, over 80% of all the land and the wealth is still in control of the white minority. It is damnable, and if somehow, if the owners, the white owners in South Africa don't proactively surrender the land, and of course there's a call by the EFF under the young leader was the African National Congress youth leader, but then somehow he was kicked out of his position by then President Zuma, who I think is a man that is vastly wealthy, as is the case of the current president of South Africa, Mr. Ramaphosa, vastly wealthy. And we hear a lot about, Soweto. Soweto, of course, is a suburb of Johannesburg, and it's terrible. It's a black enclave. But even more damnable than Soweto is a portion of the city of Johannesburg called Alexandria, which is not fit for human, for people who live there. And so when you have wealthy people like President Zuma of the past, and it's obnoxious when you look at his estate, obnoxious. And then again, Mr. Ramaphosa, how can you lead where you don't follow? And the average South African still, is not much better than being on apartheid. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Mandela put in place did not really address some of the fundamental economic situation in South Africa. And so unless the white South Africans are willing to forego the 80% plus ownership of the property in South Africa, that could still very well be a bloodletting in South Africa. It won't happen, but people are yearning now, for equity and equality, and I don't think that's too much to ask.
Now, I want to go back. During Lyndon Johnson presidency, you had the race riots, but at the same time he came out with are you familiar with the Kerner Commission report?
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
separate but unequal.
Talk to me about that report, and that was 50 years ago. What has changed? What we need to do? What needs to be done that wasn't done?
Just going back a little bit further, I was in Madrid, Spain, when I got the news that JFK, John Kennedy, had been assassinated in Dallas. And I got the shocking news that the president had been assassinated. And of course, everybody knew Lyndon Johnson, because Lyndon Johnson was quite a colorful man that talked like I talk. Some you can't put on camera. But I remember before flying back to D.C., the body of JFK being on the plane when he took the oath. And when he took the oath, he kind of shocked me when he became the president of the United States. And then he said, he added on, "and we shall overcome," which is the theme of our movement. Mm-hmm. We shall overcome. And you talk about the Kerner report and so forth, but mm-hmm. Look at the personality of Lyndon Johnson. Now, Lyndon Johnson, almost like J. Edgar Hoover, had a book on everybody. He was a ruthless man, right? And so you were able to do what John Kennedy could never have done. And so, but he made a commitment that we're going to change some things in the United States as respect with African Americans. And of course, during that time, Dr. King was on the scene. And of course, with him, with the boycott and the march from Selma to Montgomery, and all those false starts that had happened before that, and with John Kennedy getting involved when King was locked up, and then he was assassinated. But then this bully pulpit cowboy from Texas came in. Now, people often ask me the question, Clyde, who is the best president of the United States that African Americans ever had? And of course, my response is the best friends that African Americans ever had during the Civil Rights Movement was one Nikita Khrushchev from the Soviet Union, because he put the world on notice that the United States, during that time, we had two superpowers that could almost bring about global annihilation, the Soviet Union and the United States. And Nikita Khrushchev challenged the United States for being, quite frankly, a whore in the world that would going around talking about human rights, and at the same time, Khrushchev's acts. What about the black people? What are you doing to the black people in the United States? But then, absent Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, then the best president, in my view, has been Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, again, he exposed, because he had the record on people, and he blackmailed them. He said, I want to vote to give African Americans the civil rights, public accommodation. And if you don't, I'm going to expose your ass. Right? And then after we got to public accommodations, Dr. King said that's not enough. He got the Nobel Peace Prize, and then he said that's not enough. That we need to have the right to vote, because during those times, the local registrars, you'd have to have a test. And if you knew all the right answers about civics and about American history, you got all the answers right, then it'll ask you how many seeds are in an apple.
What?
Well, how many seeds in a watermelon? Anything that would preclude us from voting. And so when Dr. King had approached President Johnson and said, we need our voting rights secured, then in essence what LBJ had came back with to Dr. King, well, make me do it. And so when he couldn't do it on his own, he said, we didn't give you black people, your civil rights. I can't go back before the American people asking for you niggas to have the right to vote. And so, but if you make me do it, I'll do it. And so when Dr. King went back out and turned the heat up on the civil rights movement, and then we responded with civil disobedience, but we were nonviolent. Then the president was left with no choice when Bull Connor and whoever it was, and Clark, whoever it was, there in Selma, that beat us up on Edmund Pettus Bridge, including John Lewis, who's a brave soldier that has 80 plus years old now, and he could do us a great favor by stepping aside, because he fought a good fight. Why would he want to stay in office? Because I think most of the energy was beat out of him way back on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, because in my estimation, he's not done very many things as of late. So there's a lot of young, energetic people, like yourself, Clyde, and others, that need to step into some of these positions. So it's not only John, but people like David Scott, who's a friend, Sanford Bishop, who's a friend, they've done a marvelous job, and their health is fading now. I think David is having difficulty walking around. How would you want to hold on to power when we have so many able people that can come in and take on the banner and go forward? So I would urge people like Mr. Bishop, because I think, as far as I'm concerned, Sanford really was a Jackson man, but most I see he's done is, I think he's helped the peanut farmers to stay in office, but I don't know what he's done for us. And so I think we're time for a new crop of people to come in to serve us in the Congress of the United States, because their entity is gone.
For those who don't know about that Colonel Commission report, what did it lay out?
Well, now you can help rehearse me, and then we can go through it point by point.
It's almost like saying, if they would put money in terms of affordable housing,
Yes.
all right, they're not doing it.
Right.
But you're still using state and federal money to subsidize some other individuals who building $400,000 houses.
Oh, absolutely.
These are the discussions that need to be on the table.
Well, there's no question, Clyde, and you know, you have moved away from Atlanta temporarily, but if you drive down...
It's gotten worse.
Street, I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, and all these high-rises are coming up that's pricing, you know, African Americans out. So right before our eyes, the gentrification is taking place, and you know, places like DeKalb County and Clayton County and Carroll County and the other county going
Forest Hill.
you know, so we're being pushed out into there, you know. So I think it's time now for us to say time out. We see that people are tired of being in a pressure cooker, and if we're going to have a society that's fit for anybody to live in, then we got to move toward equality.
And I'm saying, if you look at the protest, the shooting, we need to be out there on point for the homeless, because everywhere they walk, you see them out there.
Well,
we don't have the jobs.
well, you know, again, Clyde, I just think even you know, Mayor Franklin, Mayor Bottoms put together some money for affordable housing, but now that's been put on hold because of budget shortfalls. And so what I would suggest, as you remember probably back in 1994, when the Imperial Hotel right down Peachtree Street had been sitting there vacant for a number of years.
SRO.
Yes, and when we made the decision, we're going to take this building and move the homeless in there. Now, what I would suggest to keep us from being civil disobedient, so many of these high rises across the nation, quite frankly, like even in New York City, so many of the high rises are vacant. And so I think that we need a new brand of activists that would focus their attention and would focus on, you know, the homeless. And if in fact, if we can't turn some of these buildings now that's built for the affluent, let's turn them into Section 8 housing. And they're not too good for a human being to live in. So that would be my request for consideration, not only for the government and Ms. Bottoms and others, but for the barons of industry, that it would be in your own enlightened self-interest to give housing to people that's living under the viaducts here in Atlanta and across this nation.
Now, if you go from ML King to Boulevard. Ride the Boulevard to Ponce. You had a lot of public housing there, Section 8 housing. These folks are being squeezed out because they are buying property, building $400,000 houses up there. As you said, we're sitting on a powder keg. The summer's not here yet, all right? And I feel as if there are going to be more, not the police per se, but it's almost like saying these new white neighbors coming in these old black neighborhoods, and they're going to call the police, and it's going to end up being a mini race war.
Well, the point is,
this is the tip of the iceberg.
I don't know if you read the editorial op-ed that was, they allowed me to put an op-ed in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution yesterday.
Tell me about it.
Well, what I essentially said is that we need to have an honest talk, discussion on race. And I suggested to white people, you need to stand down. Get off your high horse. And as you suggested, they've moved into the gentrified communities like Vine City and English Avenue. And then they come in to the neighborhood planning units, the NPUs. Many of them are highly educated, but they come in with their uppity attitudes to take over. It's time out for that. And if we don't have a new attitude, if we don't come with some humility, this whole thing's gonna blow up.
Would you not say where we are right now, what we see going on today in terms of the protest, this is just the tip of the iceberg?
Well, absolutely, there's no question, because right now the demonstrations are not focused, and they're marching from one venue, to another venue, but there's no action item. And I'm not, I certainly, again, not suggesting at all that we would engage in any violence. That's why I'm saying the decision makers need to be proactive, because if these demonstrators observing the fact that we have all these homeless people and we have all these high rises, high-end building that's being built that's empty, that we would focus and we would go to that particular building, there's vacancies here, let's move the homeless in this high rise. And I think that it should be done voluntarily rather than for us to force the issue.
Now, this is the other thing that I have seen since I've been out there in the street. There is no communication with our elders. It's the young folks out there. They have the energy. The elders have the knowledge. There is no relationship. How do we build that? That needs to be built.
There's no question about it. We have to build it, and somehow there's been this move, and it comes from clandestine areas, that the old folks need to sit down and be quiet. No, maybe we have to sit down because we don't have the energy, but we don't have to be quiet. I'm planning on staying out here until they take me out of here, and not breathing anymore. And so, but there's a willingness on the part of young people, I experience it all the time, to listen. And so there needs to be a collaboration between our young people and our older people. And if there's any one thing that to me is very positive about these demonstrations, is how interracial they are. And
they're organized too.
Well, and there's a disruptive
element in there
of saboteurs that's involved that is doing this property damage. We got to weed them out.
Now 123 Peachtree, the Wilburn sisters have a clothing store. They make their own design. They broke all the windows out of that.
Well, once,
And that's black owned.
Yeah, on the point is, once the adrenaline is flowing, the logic is gone. You're angry, and so you strike out at whatever it is that's around you. And so we've got to channel our rage, and we have righteous indignation. We need to channel it, and I think that that African Americans, based on our history of 246 years as slaves, and then another 100 years of terror from the KKK, and then the Civil Rights era, and then now we're in this period. And as I suggested in my op-ed piece, it's time for white people to come and stand down and to listen, and let's move toward a more equitable and just society. And if we don't, I think we're going to see some real destruction, and even gated communities. I would suggest there's no safety, because this simple phrase, no justice, no peace, and we don't want to take it beyond putting it on the side. But trust me, if we don't get some justice, and which will bring some peace, then the opposite is bound to manifest itself.
I get afraid when the youth are out there protesting, because you see how you had those renegades out there doing some violence. Those same renegades can take and fire on those officers, and you can see what happens.
Oh, there's no
from
question.
that.
I mean, we've seen it on camera where some of the people are begging, don't deface, don't do this, because it's going to be blamed on us. And so we have to be aware, and I think that the FBI and other federal agencies have infiltrated, so they know what's going on, and what we need is leadership at all levels. I think we got good leadership here in Atlanta, but we have no leadership coming from the White House. And Mr. Trump, as you know, put a big tall fence up around the White House. And I understand he's been sleeping in a bunker, which means that he's the first magnitude of a coward. And so we need a change in our government. We need more humane people in office. We need less braggadocious people that somehow think that amassing wealth and et cetera somehow it's something to make them happy, and yet there's so much poverty and so much desperation that is within our midst.
Now, in DC, the mayor just put out Black Lives Matter. Tell me, I understand they turned Black Lives Matter, but how the hell can all that matter? And you see all this homeless out here, you see these folks not making $15 an hour. What do they need to do? What are the demands?
Well, one of the things, Clyde, that we have to understand in this coronavirus season, we are what we call frontline people. And oftentimes they're thought about as police officers, firemen, and so forth. But now we understand that frontline workers are the people that work in our supermarket and attendants and stocking the shelves and manning the cash registers. They're the nurses' aides that's in the hospitals and the nursing home, the housekeepers that is on the front line, the bus drivers. They have to be paid a living wage. So the notion that $15 an hour will be that's not a livable wage. If you're a frontline worker, you need to be paid a wage that will give you dignity. And Fred, you and I have been knowing one another a long time. $15 an hour is not even drinking money for me.
Thank you. That's 2 drinks at the restaurant.
So
or going out to eat.
Yeah, so we need to recalibrate all of that. And now's the time. It's urgent.
It's almost like saying there has to be a think tank to put the issues together because of them, the youth ain't taking it.
Well, there's no question. There's a new brand out here, and we, you know,
They need our help.
well, they need our help, and because they're demanding that they not be treated with anything less than dignity of a human being, and I'm happy for that myself. I have, you know, children and grandchildren, and now great grandchildren, and so it's great grandchildren. So, you know, I have a vested interest that we live in a society and in a world that you know, is more humane. I think the other good thing, Clyde, is that that this movement and the death of this young man has brought, it's global. This is going on all over the world. There's a call out now for justice and equity, and so we must seize the moment.
Well, look, I see this. You're digging in the church. Correlate the similarity between Moses and Pharaoh. Let my people go.
Well.
And the plague that we seeing today.
Well, Jesse Jackson, who was one of my mentors, as you know, I heard him once describe the difference between Billy Graham and Martin Luther King. He said that they were both at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning preach Jesus, right? And then after the preaching Jesus, Billy Graham would go to the golf course with Pharaoh for a round of golf, and Jesse would be saying, trying to get people to march toward freedom, and so I think this dichotomy with religion, Christianity more specifically, in the United States is something we need to re-examine. I responded to a comment made by a lieutenant governor from one of the states, I don't know what state it was, and he had opinioned that that Christianity would be the bridge, love would be the bridge. And I was saying one of the big problems, we have people in leadership like him that's ignorant, dumb, that Christianity, as manifested by the European white man, has been nothing but an instrument of death and destruction, and just the opposite of love. And right out of the Vatican itself, as you know,
Doctrine of Discovery.
Yeah, we talk about doctrine of discovery. And what did it do? And what did it say? It suggested that, you know, that the Europeans need to grab the land, take possession of the land, and if the people weren't Christians, they were free to kill them.
Or if they didn't look like them, or speak their language.
Yes, and so we need to go back and revisit all of this. And, you know, we just hired a new superintendent of schools here in Atlanta. And we tried to experiment integration. But this Atlanta Public Schools, as you probably know, is probably 97% African now, because the white people refuse to have their kids to be amongst us. They got them in private schools. And so that experiment hasn't worked. And we just brought in a new superintendent. And I'm suggesting we need a superintendent that is teaching, is guiding education for Atlanta to be Afrocentric rather than Eurocentric. And so rather than us teaching that the United States is a great melting pot and that Columbus discovered America in 1492, and somehow we pit the native people, Americans, against the so-called pilgrims, the Europeans coming in, stealing, looting, and robbing, as they did, and putting the native people on reservation. It's time for us to have an accounting, and for us to come clean with our history, and then let's make adjustments. And if we're not willing to talk honestly and make adjustments, and I tremble to think about what's going to happen 10 years from now. But we have time now for us to make adjustments and to create this more perfect union.
Is that not one of the things that Asa Hilliard tried to do in the APS school system at one time? Are you familiar with that?
Well, no, Asa was a global man.
Like yourself.
That traveled throughout Africa and trying to unify, and then, unfortunately, caught malaria, and at the same time, I almost caught malaria. I was in the hospital out of my mind, but I recovered. Asa passed on, but I just think it's time now. I think we still have the time. Let's redeem the time by being honest and open, and then act on what we discover in our honest and open dialogue on the matter of race and some of the ramifications, and put things in a global perspective rather than trying to look at the world in terms of the United States, the Western world. Let's put it in a global context. That's why we're living in a global world, and if nothing else have taught us that, we're reminded now by the coronavirus that we're in one world.
Well, I'm gonna flip this script on a couple other things I wanted to ask you. Now, in terms of the television, looking at TV, I am seeing, and I'm not saying it ain't right, but I'm seeing so many black men with white women, so many gay folks. It's almost like saying the real black man don't exist. What is going on in your eyesight, or do you see it?
Well, of course, I'm no respecter of persons in my philosophy, and but when you talk about like the homosexual piece you talk about, it's always been with us, probably in the same proportion since the beginning of time. But everything is more open now and out in the public, and some of the things that, and it's kind of laughable to me that we there's so many versions of the Bible, as you know, and but African Americans, especially African American Baptist people, they have a preference for the King James version of the Bible, and while I think King James, was a murderer, he was a treacherous human being, and he was a flaming homosexual, and so it seems very strange that if African Americans wouldn't know the personality of King James, and he eventually got married. But if you go to Westminster Abbey, where he's buried, King James is buried between two of his male lovers, and his wife is buried over another spot there in Westminster Abbey. So the homosexual piece is something that has always been here, and I think that God, in His own infinite wisdom, don't make mistakes. And I think we have to become more tolerant in our
look at the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
All right. I guess in closing, what would you like to say?
Well, hang on in there. There's the end, and if you have the perseverance to say, I'm going to stay and see what the end is going to be, and a person like myself who now find themselves blessed enough to be 83 years old and still have the viability of my my body
And your mind.
and my mind, then I'm grateful. But let's let's redeem the time. And when my wife died, like in 2008, and when we put her headstone up down there in Inman, Georgia, where I came from, I had to, because I wanted to make it convenient, I put my own headstone up there, and I put down, you know, my name is on it, Joe Beasley, born 1936, and then there's a dash. And so all they have to do now is to dig the hole and then drop me in, and then they put the date on there. But I'm trying to redeem that dot.
Okay, now, in redemption, if you were demised today, tomorrow, how would you want to be remembered? Who is Joe Beasley? Who is International Joe?
Well,
My friend.
I'm the son of a sharecropper, and that had no rights, and nobody had to respect, and that was put in my face a number of times as a young boy. And so, you know, whether I'm, you know, known globally or not, but I know where I came from. I'm a humble servant, and that's how I'd love to be remembered.
Anything else you'd like to say? It's always.
Yeah, thank you, Clyde, for this opportunity.
This means a lot to me.
Thank you.